are some of the biggest myths about champagne, in addition to the fact that Dom Perignon did not invent it? Why is champagne the wine of celebration and not, say, Shiraz? And how can you find the best champagnes for your budget? Well, tonight you're going to get those tips and stories in our conversation. But before I introduce our guest, please get into the comments. Let me know where you're tuning in from, what's in your glass, what the weather is like. I'm Natalie McLean, and you've just joined one of the most passionate groups of wine lovers who gather every Wednesday at 7 p.m. to talk to the most interesting people in the world of wine. Now, this recording is based, or this video is based on a recording I made for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk, but I'll be here live with you in the comments. So get in there and let me know what stories and tips are you enjoying, what questions haven't been answered, and I'll be responding to you, as they say, in real time. Now, before I introduce our guest, let me just say that 3 of you are going to win a copy of his terrific book, Press for Champagne, A Guide to Enjoying the World's Greatest Sparkling Wine. And it's wonderful. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and let me know that you'd like to win a copy. I'll pick 3 people randomly from those who contact me. All right, back to our guest. Chris Ruhland has trained and worked as a lawyer for 30 years before becoming a mediator. He also holds a diploma in wines and spirits from the Wine and Spirit Education Trust. He passed the French Wine Scholar, Bordeaux Master Level, and Rhone Master Level examinations given by the Wine Scholar Guild, all with the highest honors. He is also an avid collector and reader of wine books, which he says take up way too much space in his home. I hear you. Chris is also the author of the award-winning Press for Champagne, A Guide to Enjoying the World's Greatest Sparkling Wines, and gives presentations about champagne and teaches wine courses as well. And he joins us now from his home in Austin, Texas. Chris, it's so great to have you here with us.
Hey, Natalie, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. Well, 'tis the season to think about champagne, though I'm sure you would argue champagne is a year-round drink, and we're going to get into that. But let's start with some of your most memorable wine moments. Tell us about the letter that you wrote to the editor of Decanter, which is one of the world's most prestigious and well-read wine magazines.
Yes, yeah. It's funny that only twice have I gotten so outraged about something I read in a publication that I decided I needed to write a letter to the editor. And of course, both of those were wine publications. But in this situation, Decanter wrote an article, and I can't remember exactly what they said, but something to the effect that champagne is a wine for celebration. And I wrote in saying that I think it's a wine for all occasions and you don't need a celebration. And I said that, it's annoying when I go out to dinner and I order champagne and the waiter says, "What are you celebrating?"
Yes.
So I came up with the response that I'm celebrating dinner. I don't know. Did I order the wrong wine or what? But in any event, they published it as the Lair of the Month, and I got a Magnum of Bollinger for my troubles.
Oh my God! I must put it on my to-do list. Right to Decanter.
That's right.
Magnum of Bollinger. Oh my God! One of the best champagnes and the double size. Now I agree with you. Champagne. We think of it. I mean, it's marketed itself so well. And we'll get to that. That it has become the wine of celebration, but I think you make it a celebration by opening champagne. And
that's exactly right.
I love your reverse theory. Open it on a non-occasion and make it an occasion rather than waiting for one. Because I think we all have bottles of champagne that are in our cellar and we've just held on to them too long. And if they don't age well, that's kind of sad. So anyway, that's great.
Yeah, there aren't enough weddings and graduations and promotions for all the champagne we want to drink.
That's true. Absolutely. Let's start today with that resolution. Share with us the story about when you were in a New York hotel bar and ordered a glass of champagne.
Yeah. So this was, late one day after a long day of work, and I just went to get a drink to take it back to my room. I ordered a glass of champagne, and just some woman who was standing there, I don't know who she was, she looked at me when I had my glass of champagne and said, "Isn't that a girl drink?"
Oh, no.
And I was just taken aback, first of all, by the inappropriateness of the comment in the first place, but I just looked at her and I said, "No, it's the best wine." And I just walked away. But it just does go to this idea that the wine is so misunderstood. First of all, You can drink champagne if you're a man. I think most people understand that, but it's just such a, it's just, there are so many aspects of champagne where it's like cabined in with all these expectations that we really don't need, honestly.
Absolutely. Well, James Bond drank champagne. He was a
That's true.
man's man, I'd
He
say.
was.
Um, and then tell us about the dinner that you and your wife enjoyed while you were visiting the Champagne region.
Yeah, well, so this was my wife's first time to Champagne, I believe, or
Okay.
at least the first time extensively visiting Champagne. And she also thought of Champagne as an aperitif at the time. So I said, let's just go to this dinner. And I bet that if we went and said, hey, we want to drink champagne through the meal, this person who is helping us will know exactly what to do. And he did. And what was just cool about it, I don't remember all the food. I don't remember the champagnes. I just know that everything worked. We had different types of champagne with the different foods that we ordered throughout the meal. And that's one thing that's great about champagne is there is such variety. There's so many different styles that you really can drink champagne throughout an entire meal and it can all work differently based on what you're eating. And so it wasn't as much a revelation to me, but it was to her. And then it also was, the revelation to me was like, other people should get to know this.
Yeah. And, in addition to the wide variety of styles of champagne, which again we'll get to, why do you think champagne is so food friendly? Is it the bubbles? Is it the acidity? What is it?
Those two things are, I think, the main component. It's the high acidity in the bubbles. It's super refreshing. So, like, if you see, for example, I know people who drink Diet Coke with everything, right? And it's the refreshing nature of that drink
Okay.
or any soft drink like that makes it appropriate.
Yeah.
And in the same way, or in a similar way, champagne, as long as the food isn't sweet and as long as it's not maybe extremely spicy, so that overwhelms the champagne, champagne will go with it. And I know because I've had champagne with steak, with cheeseburgers, and you just need to try it to see how it works. But it really does.
That's great. Okay. Steak and champagne, I love it. Is there a particular
Absolutely.
style of champagne that you would pair with heartier meat dishes?
I would a Blanc de Noir, yeah, for
Okay.
sure.
So
Just
a
having
white
more
wine made
body
from
to it.
dark grapes. Okay. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, we may as well get
Exactly.
into what the styles are so that we have our definitions up front. Um, if you want to take us through it, would you start with Blanc de Blanc first and then we get to Blanc de Noir? How would you sort of categorize them at a high level? Different
Sure. I mean,
ways.
there are so many different styles and different ways to slice the pie. But to get to what you're talking about, so a Blanc de Blanc would be a champagne made entirely from white grapes. And most often that would be 100% Chardonnay. There can also be some Pinot Blanc at times, but usually we're talking about 100% Chardonnay. Then a Blanc de Noir can be either 100% Pinot Noir or 100% Pinot Meunier or a combination of the two. And then what we mostly see are blends, right? So most champagne, if you go to the store and pick up a bottle, you will normally see it'll be a blend, some Chardonnay, some Pinot Noir, some Pinot Meunier. And that would just be a blend of the grape varieties. And then of course you have rosé champagne, and then there are other distinctions to be made, but those are the basic ones that you often see.
Right. And it's champagne to get their rosé. Most producers make it in a way that's different from the way most dry still table wines are made. What's the
Right.
difference in the way
Exactly right.
rosé champagne's made?
Yeah. So as I'm sure you're aware and your listeners are aware, most rosé is made for still wine in what would be called a maceration method, right? So you're getting some color from the skins of the grape um, that way just by making still wine.
As the skins
But
sit on the juice, as it's
exactly,
macerating, I should say. Yeah. Okay.
exactly. And some rosé champagne is made that way. Sometimes it's labeled Rosé de Saignée.
Okay.
But
The
the
bleeding method,
majority,
Desagnes, is
right,
the bleeding?
exactly. That's the idea. Yeah, it's
Okay.
not completely descriptive, but of what actually happens. But it's more like what you're talking about with still rosé.
Okay.
But in Champagne, most rosé is made in a way that is very unusual in the world of wine, which is you make a white wine, and then you take red wine and you pour some red wine into the white wine to add the color.
Okay.
Usually somewhere between 5 and 10% of still Pinot Noir poured into the white wine, which often can be, it can be Chardonnay, but it can also be Chardonnay and Pinot Noir made white. But that is a very interesting and different way to make rosé, and it's what's typically done in Champagne.
And why did they choose to do that versus the way that still rosés are made?
Yeah, there's a very practical reason to do it that way, which is that, of course, red wine has tannin, right? And one thing you really don't want for the most part in Champagne is noticeable tannin, right? And given that you're making a lot of wine, you're making it once a year perhaps, or it's during the year, but it's one harvest. Um, you if you make it the Saignee method, let's say, and you somehow get too much tannin or too much color, that can be a real problem. So what the method of pouring the red wine into the white wine does is allow you to really control that element. You've already made the white wine; it's good, and you can start doing trials. With how much should you put 6% red wine? Should you put 7%? What makes the most sense? And once you've got that dialed in, then you make the wine. And it's just from a perspective of making sure that you get what you want and that you don't get what you don't want.
Right.
It's a more practical way of doing it.
Interesting. I never knew that explanation. Do you have a couple of favorite rosé champagne producers?
I mean, well, first of all, most champagne producers that are significant make a rosé.
Okay.
I love so many different rosé champagnes. I will say, and I should, I hate to start at the very top, but Cristal champagne is incredibly expensive, and a lot of people are never going to try it. However, if you have the opportunity to try it, it's outstanding. It may be the best rosé champagne that there is.
Wow. What makes it so
Going
great compared to
Yeah,
others?
and it's funny. I could tell you that by giving you descriptors and berries and things like that. It's more, and I probably wouldn't start there if you've never really explored rosé champagne. It's
Sure.
more the impact that it has on a whole. It's the complexity, the harmony, the texture, and the length of the wine that if you've already had a lot of champagne, just blows your mind. It's one of those things that it's the subjective experience that is almost indescribable. But if you were to go down from there, I think Billecart Saumon is very well known for its rosé champagnes, for example, and they
Right.
and throughout their line of champagnes, they're very good. Veuve Clicquot makes outstanding rosé champagnes. So there are a lot of options. I guess I would say, I mean, now that you've got me talking, Baresh is a grower. Baresh, I think it's Campagne Remissis. My French pronunciations are horrible, but something to that effect, is also an insanely good rosé.
Wow, I'm getting thirsty.
Yeah.
Why does your wife call you an extreme hobbyist?
Well, because she's right. I mean, when I get into a hobby, I dive into it very deeply. So in this example, I couldn't just learn about wine and read about it and enjoy it. I had to get the WSET diploma. I had to write a book about it. It's the same with just about everything else I get into. And if you saw our garage, you'd see that in action.
Was there an aha moment or aha champagne that turned you on to champagne in particular?
Yeah, I can't say for sure that there was. I do remember early on having a bottle of Hide Seek Rare. It's now just called Rare, which I thought was next level. But really, what drove me to be interested in champagne was the diversity of champagne, finding so many champagnes that were different, that were unusual. And I thought that was fascinating because so many people just they think of champagne as if champagnes are interchangeable to some extent.
Right.
And I found that was not the case, and that's what made me really interested in it.
And then tell us about the time you sabered an expensive bottle of champagne with a World War I cavalry sword. What inspired that?
Sometimes it's kind of a dumb thing to do because you lose champagne when you do that. But I bought this sword at an antique shop in New Orleans years ago, and New Year's Eve 2013, it had been a difficult year. I was home with my two sons, who were much younger at the time, of course, and we decided we're going to have a fun night. So we cooked, we watched movies, and I savored a bottle of champagne in the backyard. And my older son, I think he was maybe 13, 14, 14 at the time. He took a video of it, which I actually watched again last night, and I laugh every time I watch it. So it was just fun.
Did you get it on the first try? The shearing off the top?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward to do. It's not much of a parlor trick. Anybody can do it, and you don't need a saber. You can just use a knife. What
Yeah.
you do is you do it once, you realize you can do it, you realize it was fun, and then you go back to just opening the bottle the regular way after that.
Absolutely. I mean, there's lots of videos on YouTube too that can show you how to do that if you're
Yeah,
curious. Because you do want to find the seam, the weakest part of the bottle, and go
exactly.
up to the neck with a decisive whatever. But I've seen people do it with a spoon too.
Yeah,
So,
there's
but
all sorts of ways to do it, and you're right.
the saber's much more impressive. That's
It is. The saber's more fun.
Before we dive into the book, your legal career and your writing seem very different, the wine writing. How did you make the transition? And were there skills that overlapped?
Yeah, so I think good lawyers are good writers,
Uh-huh.
and lawyers have to investigate, analyze, and explain. So it's not so different to take a subject like champagne and do the same thing. What is different is that legal writing is cabined in to a large extent by an expected style. I wrote a book for lawyers when I was practicing law. It was published by a legal publisher, and I wrote it in a way that lawyers reading it would expect to see, right, and they would understand. This book was fun because I could just completely break out of that style and write in a way that was just more personal and fun, frankly, for me to write. So I would say that's the main difference. But really, um, to a large extent, there are skills that bleed over.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I was in high tech marketing and we would write customer success stories. That was my favorite part, the research and the writing. It never occurred to me that I could do other types of writing. But there is a transfer of skills and it's just a much freer space when you get into wine because it's really, you know, touching on people's lives and all facets of human endeavor. It ties to everything.
Yeah, and especially in this case where, I self-published the book,
Yes,
so I didn't have somebody telling me what they thought I should say or how I should say it,
right.
and there's a freedom in that too.
Absolutely. So, what drew you to the story in the first place? Why champagne? We talked about your passion for champagne. There's so much diversity. Is it just because you sort of focused on it because it intrigued you most as a wine, and then your extreme hobbyism took over and you decided to write a book?
Well, that's it to a large extent, but also, what happened was I would talk to friends about wine, people who aren't wine geeks, right? And they would enjoy wine. And one thing I noticed is that they seemed to know less about champagne than they did other wines.
Hmm.
They didn't really even treat it as a wine. It was just a thing to have before you actually got serious and drank wine. And I thought this was really strange and wrong. And I wanted to fix it in the sense that I wanted people to see what I saw in Champagne. So when I wrote the book, that's what I thought about. I thought about friends who fit into this category, and I thought how I would explain Champagne to them if they were sitting right in front of me.
Hmm.
And then I essentially wrote what I would say.
Right. Yeah. No, it's great. Great conversational style. Um, Maybe tell us a little bit about how this book is different from other books on champagne. Certainly, you weren't after an encyclopedia about champagne, but how
Right.
would you explain it to someone who's thinking about buying your book?
Yeah, so the book is different not only from other books about champagne, but really from almost every other wine book that's written these days. So this book is a drinker's guide to knowing and loving champagne. It's a guide to telling you or showing you how to understand different styles and types of champagne, how to figure out for yourself what you like and why, and how to explore champagne so that you get the most out of it. So, whereas most other wine books focus on the objective facts surrounding a wine, like the history, the climate, the production, the producers, etc., my book is all about the subjective experience of the wine drinker. So, any facts in the book are there solely to help the reader develop that subjective experience, as opposed to cramming a bunch of knowledge in their heads that you would need, let's say, for a wine exam.
Right. I think that's much more interesting in the approach. Um, what was the most surprising thing you learned while researching or writing your book?
I mean, I suppose, I guess, I knew a lot about Champagne when I was writing it, but I guess the most surprising insight I had was that the book actually served its purpose on me while I was writing
Uh,
it. So
Okay.
I'd had all the champagnes that were discussed in the book, but I drank them all again while writing it. And it was very interesting to see that I actually appreciated champagne more than I had before when I sat down and drank in this comparative way that I lay out in the book. So it was interesting to see that at least for me, it made sense, and I got something out of the book in that way.
That's great. Well, you are reader number one when you
That's
write a
right.
book, so let's hope.
That's right.
What was the most difficult part of writing the book?
Well, the most difficult part was really trying to find a balance between saying too much and too little.
Right.
I think when you write a book, a wine book, you have to describe wines and what they taste like with some manner of objectivity, right? But I really didn't want to do that too much because the whole point of the book is to encourage readers to explore champagne on their own terms.
Hmm.
So if I was too descriptive, it just takes some of the joy out of the exploration. And also, I think to the average wine drinker, the person I'm writing to, technical information about wine is really boring. I don't know about you, but like my
Yes.
friends, they don't want to read about yeast strains and they don't want to read about pruning methods. So I try to give details that you need to know if you want to enjoy champagne a lot more than you do now, but
Right.
leave out other things that you don't really need to know. And if you want to know them, you can look them up somewhere.
Oh, that's great. Excellent. And what is the story behind the title of your book, Press for Champagne? I like
Well,
that.
I
I want
mentioned
a
this.
button.
Yeah, and they are available. I have one.
Oh,
But so yeah, I mentioned this in the book, but there's a restaurant in London that has press for champagne buttons in the actual booth. It's a very cool restaurant, not just because of that, but um, and the buttons are actually hooked up. Um, so if you press the button, someone will come out and bring you champagne or know that you need champagne. So
I
that
love
was the
that.
inspiration. And then I also bought a button, like I said, to hang in my home. But I also wanted to recognize that there's just something intrinsically joyful about champagne and to indicate that the book is about drinking champagne. So
Yes.
that's how I got the title.
Well, that button, I wish I had had that in the hospital when I was delivering my son rather than
Yeah,
epidurals, like
yeah,
press for champagne. Yes, please.
yeah,
Anyway, I love that.
absolutely.
And as you said, you mentioned that champagne delivers immediate joy, laughter, surprise, and conviviality. Why do you think champagne has this universal appeal, even for those who aren't diehard wine enthusiasts?
Well, I think it's two things. I mean, I think first of all, champagne has this tradition of being a wine of celebrations. Even if it's not only for celebrations, it's at weddings, it's at parties,
Hmm.
it's at graduations. So you're starting with a beverage that you already have these memories of that just represents happiness.
Yes.
And I also think that the bubbles have something to do with it too. I mean, bubbles are just fascinating and they're kind of fun. For whatever reason, there's this certain lightness to a wine that has bubbles. So I think those two things combined create this effect that we see.
Absolutely. There's a textural thing, but also just bubbles bursting in kind of your
Yeah,
nose a little bit, tickling your
yeah,
nose. I don't know.
yeah, absolutely.
So, champagne has definitely earned its status as the wine of celebration, but how did it do that when you write in the book it lost out to Burgundy 300 years ago when it was trying to be the wine of the court? And of course, that's what set the fashion back then. They didn't have social media. So,
Right.
how did it get to be the wine of celebration?
Well, so and that what I talk about losing that competition, that's when, Champagne made still wines, which, it's important to recognize Champagne has made still wines for many, many hundreds of years, much longer than it's been making sparkling wines.
Hmm.
But, the association between Champagne and celebrations has really deep historical roots in Champagne. Um, French kings were coronated in Reims, in the Champagne region with wine, going back to the 5th century. And so this association between French royalty and Champagne, again, it wasn't sparkling champagne, has very deep roots. And then you have Louis XIV, who was a big advocate of champagne, and again, the court being important. Um, and then over time, you also had marketing, frankly, where when champagne became sparkling, it became marketed as the wine of royalty, the wine of the czar. After that, there was, marketing where it was on, cruise ships like the Titanic, and it was in advertising for airplanes and automobiles when cars were a luxury item.
Yes.
So,
Well, James
it's
Bond had a
it's
fold-out compartment, and out came the champagne glasses, right?
yeah,
Not that
exactly.
we advocate for that today, but it was pretty
I
nifty.
would like one, yes, for
Yeah.
sure. I
Yeah.
would love to have one. Um, just sit in my driveway and use it.
Yes.
But
Exactly.
yeah, so it's those two things. I mean, it's historical roots, and then frankly, it's just a lot of marketing. Plus, it's the bubbles again. They're fun.
And I heard the Titanic was one of the few ships that was not, what do you call, launched or baptized with by breaking a bottle of champagne over its hull. I don't know if you
I
came
don't
across
know
that myth.
I don't know if it was or not. But again, that's another thing. Breaking champagne. Um,
Yeah.
and it's kind of morphed into sparkling wine. If you watch like Formula One races, for
Right.
example, now they use an Italian sparkling wine. I understand next year they're going to go back to using champagne, which I think is nice. Uh, but yeah, all sorts of things like that, just in combination, have led to this feeling that we have about wine and celebrations.
Yeah, it is the wine of first baby, first marriage, probably second marriage, third
Yeah,
marriage, but
any marriage. Yeah.
coronation, first yacht, whatever. Now, your book debunks some popular champagne myths. Can you share a couple of those with us?
Yeah, and there are a lot of them. I would say, well, to take a couple I can think of offhand. So I hear people talk about Grand Cru champagne, for example, with reverence, and I talk about this in the book as if Grand Cru champagne is categorically better than champagne without that distinction. That's not true. It's something I explain in the book.
And maybe you could
Another,
just give us a Coles
sure,
Notes version. Why isn't it as we think the
yeah.
best?
So in my attempt to to do this briefly is going to be the best I can, but
Sure.
essentially in Champagne, Grand Cru refers to an entire village, not a vineyard, as it does in say Burgundy. The whole system of Grand Cru and Premier Cru came out of a pricing scheme in the early 20th century between growers and producers in an effort to really make transactions smoother. So they just designated entire villages Grand Cru, and producers would pay a certain price for those grapes, no matter where they came from in the village, and then down. But it became very political, and the system doesn't exist anymore. But champagne is still permitted to be labeled with those with Grand Cru or Premier Cru from the villages that were such at the time the system collapsed. And so I've had, you can find Grand Cru champagne, it just happens to be from a Grand Cru village that's not very good. And then you have champagnes, like just to give an example, we talked about Cristal. That is not Grand Cru champagne.
Wow.
Neither is Dom Perignon. Some of the best champagne, Clos de Gauisse, is not Grand Cru champagne. So it's unfortunate that there's this perception, and that's that.
Yeah, no,
Once you
that's
get
a
me
good
started with
explanation.
this one, I may go on too long.
No, that's a good explanation. I wasn't aware of that one. Is there another one, another myth you would like to debunk?
Well, I also think that you hear people saying that vintage champagne is better than non-vintage champagne. That's something
Right.
else that is just, again, as a category, you can't say it's true. In certain limited instances, it can be true, but again, there's plenty of vintage champagne that's not very good. There's plenty of non-vintage champagne that's outstanding. So this is again one of the things I talk about in the book is trying to get our arms around what's true and what's not in champagne and why to help you figure out, to just to cut through some of the BS in champagne, basically.
Sure. Sure, that's an important distinction because if I understand correctly, and just correct me if I'm wrong, non vintage champagne is kind of the signature of the champagne houses. They try to be consistent year after year. It's kind of their big focus. Whereas vintage champagne is declared, I don't know if it's 3 or 4 years out of 10, maybe more now that with climate change, but that's often not their what they consider the proof of their mastery of champagne making. It's the non-vintage champagne that is their pride.
Yeah, it can depend. That's the thing. It really can
Depends.
depend
Yep.
on producers, and we could go through examples. But I mean, again, that's also not, I think that's closer to the truth, what you just said. But again, it's not totally reliable in every instance. But I mean, you are right in the sense that, I mean, a lot of effort is put into non-vintage champagnes often because that's the vast majority of bottles that are purchased are non-vintage champagnes.
Right. Okay. Um, Now you discussed the legal definition of champagne and efforts to protect its name. How has the champagne only comes from Champagne, France campaign impacted consumer awareness and the global sparkling wine market?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been good for champagne, but also good for other sparkling wines. I mean, it's a situation where I think there's more awareness now that champagne is one type of sparkling wine. Enough people have said that over and over and over again. That, Prosecco is not champagne; it's a different type of sparkling wine made somewhere else. Um, and so, in Prosecco, for example, it's the best-selling sparkling wine by volume. So lots of people enjoy it, but it's not champagne. And so, I think it's helped champagne maintain its price proposition, frankly, by
Mm-hmm.
saying that there's something exclusive here
Yes.
that we have, and I think that's one of the more significant impacts, probably effects, probably of that campaign, and probably what it was designed for.
And did you say Prosecco is the number one type of sparkling wine that's
Yeah,
sold in
by
the world?
volume,
By volume,
yes,
yes.
yeah,
Okay, interesting. And still on the marketing vein, some houses like Bollinger have tied into popular culture. This may have been before product placement in movies and such that it may have just been happenstance, but James Bond being a prime example, and he had the glove compartment that would come out and he would always reference his Bolly. Do you think that kind of branding enhances or detracts from the appreciation of champagne?
I, I think I would say both.
Okay, yes.
So on the one hand, I mean, and this is true of any wine or really almost anything we consume. The way we experience a wine when we drink it is influenced by more than the liquid alone, right? Unless
Mm-hmm.
you're drinking the wine blind. And we know that from all sorts of studies, that the label and your associations with the label are going to matter in terms of how you experience this wine. So if you have a positive association with Bollinger because you saw a James Bond movie, I mean, I think that could contribute to your appreciation of the wine. You could enjoy it more, and that's a very reasonable conclusion. And then, of course, there's situations where branding can backfire too. So it could be a double-edged sword. But so I think it's both. I mean, I think it does enhance our appreciation of the wine when we see, Dom Perignon enjoyed by a celebrity, let's say, or in your case, Bollinger with James Bond. Um, and then, there's at the same time, you can also just enjoy it for what it is. You can get beyond that to some extent over time, perhaps, um, and enjoy it for what's in the bottle.
Sure. And speaking of celebrities, you mentioned Jay Z's boycott of Cristal. Cristal is made by Louis Roederer. What happened? What was going on there? Jay Z, the rap artist, also
Yeah,
married
so
to Beyonce, I
so
think.
yes, I believe you're correct. Yeah, so in that case, he had mentioned Cristal in his music, and apparently was a fan of Cristal. And then the managing director of Lee Roeder at the time did an interview with The Economist, and it was asked whether Cristal's association with hip hop music was bad for the brand, something like that. And he said something to the effect of, "It might be, but we can't stop them from drinking it," which wasn't particularly sensitive.
Right.
And so Jay Z reacted to that in only the kind of way that he would, which is decide he's going to buy his own or create his own champagne brand. So he bought Armand de Briac, which is also known as Ace of Spades. I think since then he sold half of it to LVMH, and he started mentioning Ace of Spades in his music. So it's an interesting, back to what we are talking about branding. If you don't do it right, it can go wrong in some directions. And in their case, that was something that they probably regret. I
Yeah,
would guess.
probably. I think they were a
Yeah.
little put off by the fact he was pairing Cristal and Cheetos in some of the lyrics, but hey, could be
Yeah, but
brilliant
see,
pairing.
the other thing is, I mean, personally, I don't think, I think his association with the brand was very positive. I don't think his, or even any of hip hop music association with Cristal or Dom is negative. I think it's a good thing. So
Hmm.
I think they kind of lost an important customer there.
Absolutely. It has the potential of revitalizing the brand the way Madonna has always sort of paired up with younger singers and has had this amazingly long career as a result. I think there could be real value there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So the narrative about Dom Perignon, the blind Benedictine monk who is
Right.
credited with
Right.
inventing champagne,
Yeah.
is actually not true. What parts are true and what aren't?
Well, so okay, so the part that's not true is he did not that he invented sparkling wine or invented sparkling champagne. So champagne wasn't a sparkling wine in any significant way until after his death. Um, so I'd say the major part isn't true. But what is true is he was the cellar master of the Abbey in OVA. You can actually visit the Abbey today. And at the time, he was just a very important figure in Champagne in terms of wine production, advancing wine quality, advancing grape quality. He was very focused on improving the quality of the vines. He mastered gently pressing the grapes to make white wine from red grapes, which is something that's important in Champagne. So he was an important figure, but what happened was this myth around him, and he wasn't blind either, as far as anybody
Ah,
knows.
okay.
So so the cartoonish Dom Perignon that we have now, there's a statue. If you go to Moet, there's a statue of Dom Perignon. Well, nobody knows what he looked like. So there aren't any photographs or paintings of him. So
Yeah,
that's
he's like
just
Duncan Hines,
yeah,
like Alan
right.
Crocker.
Yeah. So yeah, so there's this cartoonish version of him that Moet very smartly appropriated in the early 20th century for its prestige cuvee, and that's how it lives on.
Wow. Okay. All right. Um, how do you think social media has played a role in shaping our perception of champagne?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think so. Social media has done a few things that I think are very positive in terms of champagne. I think one is to some extent it's promoted champagne to a younger audience. Basically, back to what you were talking about earlier. Um, champagne just can't be an old person's drink, right? If they want to be successful. So the fact that you see younger people posting photographs of champagne, it just kind of really broadens the audience for champagne, I think, which is a very positive thing. I think also the fact that social media is constant. To some extent, there's this deseasonalization of champagne consumption. You mentioned that, and it's true, a lot of champagne is purchased in December.
Mm,
Um,
right.
but when you look at social media and you got a lot of wine pictures, you see champagne being consumed every single day in all sorts of settings. And so I think it's helped promote this idea that you can drink champagne in March on your patio or
Hmm.
or whatever. And so I think among other things, I think that's been very positive.
Yeah, they call it, well, they have called champagne the poinsettia wine because 75% of sales traditionally was between American Thanksgiving and Christmas, so, or the
Right.
holidays. Um, and what about, let's talk about another historic figure, Winston Churchill. What was his
Hmm.
influence on champagne, the British
Well,
Prime
his
Minister?
real influence is he drunk a lot. He drank a lot of it,
So he was good for
and
sales.
yeah, right. He drank a lot of it. He was a big consumer of food and alcohol, and he really loved Paul Roger champagne. And so then they have named their prestige cuvee, which is a wonderful champagne, Winston Churchill. So that's and if you look on their website and their advertising, they play up this connection between the house and Winston Churchill. Um, I think he's still a popular figure or a well-known positively viewed figure, and to that extent, they've ridden off of that eventually.
Right, right. Yep. The man was prodigious in his output, his writing output. I don't know how he did it. He seemed to be drinking all the time, but
Yeah, and eating all the time. Yeah.
what a mind. How do you feel about the luxury pricing of champagne? You've mentioned Cristal. What does that go for these days? Is it $500 a pop, like a
Oh my
bottle, or
gosh. Well,
maybe
first of
more?
all, I just have to say you're pointing to the one part of my book that didn't age well, which is the
The
prices in
pricing?
2021.
Sure,
Although
sure.
I did say in the book that they were 2021 prices, but my gosh, since then, between just general inflation and then increase in champagne prices, the prices have gone way up. So Cristal, which in 2021, you could find for $200, which is still a good
U.S.,
amount of
I should
money.
say. Yes.
What's that?
U.S. dollars.
Sorry,
Tack on
yes.
30% for us in Canada.
Here I
That's
am in
okay.
Austin, Texas. Yeah,
Yeah.
in US dollars, $200.
Yep.
Now is well over $300. Depending on the vintage, obviously, if you're looking for older and outstanding vintages, you can pay a lot more. But yeah, every time I look, the prices are going up. It's quite depressing, but it is what
And
it is.
do you think that's just one of the marketing factors, as you say, that is what it is, or do you think does it hurt champagne at all because it just makes it so exclusive that only that a lot of younger consumers can't even touch it. They're not even gonna. I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean, I think there are a few things going on. First of all, there are some champagnes that are still reasonably priced. You can
okay,
still buy champagne. So I'm just going to say that everything I say is in US dollars. So, but
sure,
you can still find champagnes for $40, $45. Not priced that differently from other wines of the same quality level. But but yes, with the higher priced champagnes, I think obviously just have supply and demand in play, right? But what
right,
you also have is the fact that luxury goods of all types, they need to be thought of as luxury goods to perpetuate that kind of success and feeling. You see this with all sorts of things. I mean, I don't know how much does an Hermes handbag cost, and should it cost that much, right?
true.
So, or even with the wine, you see this in Napa Valley all the time, where pricing for some wines are intentionally very high, simply to put it in that category of a luxury wine. So I think I think all those factors are at play.
Sure, sure, absolutely. You write about the evolution of wine glasses. What's your take on the recent trend of using a white wine glass instead of the traditional elongated flute for champagne?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm all for the white wine glass.
Okay,
I don't like flutes. I make that clear in the book and
and why is
elsewhere
that?
because you can't smell the wine. I mean,
Right.
that's the real problem. I mean, they're
Yep.
way too thin to get the aromas from the wine. I use these like tulip shaped glasses like
Ah,
this for the
there you
most
go.
part.
Yeah.
And if you go to Champagne, you'll see these in use all over the place. I don't remember seeing flutes the last time I went to Champagne. And but when I go to a restaurant and I order a bottle of champagne, and I have the idea that they might put it in a flute, I just ask right away if they can just give us white wine glasses.
Sure.
And a lot of times it's interesting from sommeliers. They say, "Oh yeah, that's how I enjoy it too."
Right. Right.
So yeah, I'm a big fan of the white wine glass for
I am
champagne.
too, for swirling and all the rest of it.
Yep.
And speaking of, while we're on the glassware top or glass topic, you have a strong stance against clear glass bottles for champagne. So why did you want to highlight that issue in your book?
I mean, it is one thing that is super annoying is that um, because clear glasses for wine, especially a more delicate wine like champagne, you really have the possibility of getting what's called light strike, and you can have this oniony, garlicky taste in your wine.
Wow.
And so I just don't think it's a good idea. And I did, I, you know, when I wrote the book, I did mention Ruinart's Blanc de Blanc, which is sold in a clear glass bottle, and they promote the fact that it's in a clear glass bottle. Now, at about the same time, they started selling it in what they call second skin, which is a covering.
Okay.
I've still seen these bottles without the skin, and I'm not sure that consumers understand that they're meant to stay on and
Hmm.
protect the wine.
Hmm.
Cristal, to be fair, its bottles are clear too, but they have a long history of covering it in this foil and also putting it in a box. And I think people who buy Cristal are more likely to store it appropriately.
Yeah, and doesn't the
Um,
covering have a special like light? It blocks
yeah,
UV light or something like that. It's this really
exactly.
golden, not saran wrap, but yeah, covering. And it's really beautifully done the way they've sort of wrapped it in that before putting it in the box.
Exactly. Yes, and that's the purpose of it, and it seems to work. And again, in their case, there's a tradition of having that glass bottle, and I think it's not great that they do it either, but I think it's probably less dangerous than what other producers do.
Hmm.
But it's a risk. Not obviously most bottles are going to be totally fine, but
Sure.
yeah, I would hate to take the risk.
Yeah. The crystal becomes cloudy. You discuss the importance of temperature when it comes to champagne. Do you have a temperature range for champagne, or is it going to vary by style, or what kind of serving tips do you have
Yeah,
with
so there are
temperature
different
levels
thoughts
wise?
on that. My thought is that it should be cold.
Right.
So, I mean, I put it in an ice bucket or in the refrigerator and make it cold. In fact, I've got bottles right here. This is the first time I ever brought an ice bucket to my study, but I've got, I mean, because I don't know, but I don't want to drink warm champagne. And
Right.
also, it really does affect the texture of the wine,
Hmm.
affects affects the bubbles. So um, I think making it cold and this doesn't seem that difficult to make it cold, but I've seen people the mistake I see a lot of times is in restaurants and at people's homes. They'll have an ice bucket, they'll layer some ice on the bottom, and they'll just drop the bottle
Mm.
on top of the ice, which
Right.
is not going to make the bottle cold.
Right.
So you need to put water in
Exactly.
there, ice and water.
Yeah, and ice and water combined is faster than even having a full bucket of ice. Like it's more
Correct.
dispersed, the cold against the bottle, science and
Exactly.
everything. Yeah.
Exactly.
Is there, apart from freezing it, but is there a temperature at which champagne is too cold? You can't appreciate the aromas?
I mean, yes, I mean, obviously, and again, you're in Celsius and I'm in Fahrenheit, I think. But I mean, if you put it in, you wouldn't want it colder than it gets in your refrigerator. Let's put it that way. You certainly wouldn't want to put it in the freezer. Well, of course, it, because it's 12.5% alcohol, if you put it in the freezer, it will eventually freeze. But you just wouldn't want it that cold. And frankly, the thing is, if you have it in your refrigerator and you pour it in a glass, it's going to start warming up immediately. So the temperature is going to increase. So the point is to start at a cool temperature, get it into your glass. It's immediately going to be a little bit warmer. And I just think that's the way it's going to be enjoyed best for most people.
I agree. I agree. Um, and the book delves into the history of champagne production. What do you consider to be kind of the most important or pivotal moment in the development of champagne as we know it today?
I think the most pivotal moment would have to be Louis the XV in 1728 decreeing that wine could be transported in bottles. It
Hmm.
seems strange now to think that that would be an issue, but before that, for all sorts of reasons and tax reasons, wine had to be transported only in barrels, which obviously does not work for a sparkling wine. That's going to lose bubbles if you were to do that. So that really opened up the door to really sell sparkling champagne in significant quantities. And in fact, the very next year, in 1729, Ruhnart became the first champagne house producing sparkling wines, and the rest is history. So I guess we have King Louis the XV to thank for all of this.
Thanks, Louis. And it was the English that perfected the bottles that were strong enough to hold champagne without it exploding versus the
Right,
French, because they were perfecting coal-fired furnaces, which burn
exactly.
much more hotter than wood. Okay, so
Yeah,
that was
exactly.
also probably pretty important as well. But
Yes.
yeah, cool. What surprised you most about the technical side of champagne production during your research?
Well, I think, let's see, I think when I was writing the book, nothing surprised me about the technical side because I understood it. But I will say that most people are surprised at how much work has to take place in the winery to make a bottle of champagne. I mean, that's what I think is interesting and surprising to most people. And you think about making wine, it's not that making wine is easy, but in concept, it's simple, and human beings have been doing it for thousands of years, right?
Right.
You need grapes, put it in a vessel somewhere, and pretty soon you're going to get wine. But champagne is very much a human-made product. Like you have to do a whole bunch of things, and you have to do them well at a certain amount of time to make a single bottle of champagne. And so I think, and I describe it, fortunately, I think hopefully briefly in my book so that it's not too detailed. But I think it's interesting that, once you appreciate, you hold a single bottle of champagne, you think, wow, this bottle, and this wine has been through a lot. Like a lot was done to make this bottle of wine.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many more steps. We'll talk
Yeah,
about a few of them. So one of the important steps or some of the important steps, contributions were from women in Champagne's history, like Veuve Clicquot, whom you've mentioned. Veuve means widow, of course. Can you share? And she developed the riddling technique, the
right.
turning the bottles, and eventually the what is it? The spent yeast ends up in the neck of the bottle, and then you can
Exactly.
disgorge, get it out of there, and then it's nice and clear. Can you share some other notable women who influenced champagne production?
Yeah, it's fascinating that I mean, of course, today lots of women are involved in champagne. They're in charge of making the wines, in charge of the houses. Um, but when you go back in the history of wine, you don't. I think it's rare to see so many women involved
Yes.
in really important aspects. And the widow Clicquot, she not only created Ritalin with her rack, but she also is credited with making the first rosé. Then you have Madame Pommery, who created the first brut or dry champagne and really led the shift away from the sweeter styles. Previous to her doing that, most champagne was very sweet, something you wouldn't recognize today. And so that was new. And then you have Lily Bollinger, who was very instrumental in the history of that house in the mid 20th century, including creating this recently disgorged concept and a new style of aged champagne. So yeah, it's I'm not sure that there's another wine region, and I there might be, but I'm not sure there's another one that when you go back and look at the history of it, you see so many women that involved.
I call them the merry widows of moose because a
Yeah,
lot of them were widows. They had
yeah,
lost their husbands to illness or the war, and so they
yeah,
carried on rather than just handing the reins of the business over to a cousin or a brother or whatever.
right.
Now, your book explores the different types of champagnes, which we've touched on: Blanc de Blanc, white grape to make the white wine, or Blanc de Noir, and so on. What style do you find the most intriguing?
See, it's hard for me to answer that because I find them all intriguing.
Okay.
So I have a really Catholic taste in champagne. But if I had to say one, I would say I would probably say rosé because of what we talked about. That rosé is not really considered a luxury product in the world of wine for the most part. It's considered a $10,
Right.
$15, just pound it at the pool type product.
Yes.
Whereas in champagne, rosé champagne is a very often a very premium luxury product. So for example, we talk about Cristal or Dom Perignon. The rosé versions of those wines are more expensive than the non-rosés. Uh, so I think that mm, if I had to pick one, which I really don't want to, I would say that I would say rosé.
I'd agree with you. And they're, to a certain extent, they're difficult to make. They're more difficult to make. Do rosé champagnes, do they comprise only like about 5% of total champagne production? I know it's low,
Yeah,
but
it's low. I don't have the exact percentage
sure.
in mind, but it is a very low percentage for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Um, what was the significance of the Champagne riots in 1911?
Hmm. Well, I mean, I think. So just to say what they are, I mean, the Champagne riots involved really growers in the Marne Valley who were upset about two things. Well, one thing, but then a subset. But what they're really upset about is that they believed that grapes from outside of Champagne were being used by the houses for
Mm.
their Champagne, cheaper grapes than the grapes sold by growers in Champagne. And there was this dispute, this also about whether the Aube, which is in southern part of Champagne, the southern part of Champagne, whether it was really Champagne or not, whether that should be included. And the outcome of all this was really the modern definition of what Champagne and what it is not. So, now the OLB is part of Champagne. That's established and Champagne delineated, and it's part of the whole trend in the early part of the 20th century, really to delineate wine regions, right? All over the world in France, we know what the borders of the wine regions are, and this was part of that. And it also led to more cooperation, frankly, between growers and houses that we see today, where they really work together. And not that they don't have differences of opinion, but they're not trying to kill one another anymore. So that's good.
Things have come a long way.
Yeah.
Interesting. And you also discussed the impact of World Wars One and Two on champagne production. How did the region recover, and what were the lasting effects on the industry?
Well, the recovery was just pure resilience. When you think about World War One, it was fought in Champagne vineyards,
Because it's at
and
the crossroads of Europe, right? It is
yeah,
geographically, it's been invaded and all sorts of times throughout history.
yeah. World War One was particularly bad for Champagne. I mean, it literally was fighting in the vineyards of Champagne.
Wow.
At the same time, the czars were deposed in Russia, and Tsarist Russia was a huge market for Champagne. So it was kind of a double whammy. But it was just pure resilience. After that, you just keep going. I mean, sometimes all you can do is just keep going.
Yeah.
And
Well,
World War II was a different situation in that Champagne continued to be was produced, but it was produced uh, under the overseeing of Germans, and a lot of wine went to Germany. Um, so the lasting effect, I guess, would be the sense of resilience, cooperation within the region, and to some extent, the ends of both wars reinforced the idea of Champagne as a wine that's valuable and that's is part of celebrations.
right. Was it Napoleon? In victory we need it, or in victory we toast with it, and in defeat we need it.
Yeah,
Either way,
right. It's
got you
something to
coming and
that
going.
effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He's credited with that. It's not clear whether he said it, but
Right.
it's a good quote anyway.
Another myth.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I was in Champagne, I was so impressed with their joie de vivre, and even in the architecture and the things that had been built after the wars. They just wanted to express that, as you say, resilience and exuberance for life. It was really heartwarming to see that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned the magic of Champagne's chalky soils, but also suggest it's not as central as some people would believe. How does chalk contribute to Champagne's qualities?
Yeah. Well, okay, so you're asking my opinion, of course. I'm the
Yes.
only one here, but first of all, I just have to say that I definitely have a bias on the scale. I'm on the denier side of soil. Let's put it that way. I'm not in
Okay.
full denial of soil, but I'm not on the far other side of the cheerleaders for soil. Um, and the reason is that I mean the things that are said about soils, and in this instance, champagne soils, just some of these things we know just aren't true. So, there's a lot of chalk in Champagne. That's talked about. Chalk is very good for the vineyards in Champagne. I mean, it's actually very good that there's chalk there because the chalk bedrock provides excellent drainage, which is very crucial. You get a lot of water in a cool, wet climate. But it's also good for water retention. So the chalk retains enough moisture to sustain the vines during dry periods. So it's not that chalk doesn't do anything. It's actually quite good. But remember, Champagne in those very same vineyards was making red and white still wines for hundreds of years. And people didn't say, oh, my wine tastes chalky.
Right.
And so this is where I have issues where, chalk doesn't taste like anything. I don't know if you ever tried to taste chalk, but it doesn't have a taste. And if it did, I mean, the chalk isn't pulled up by the vines into the grapes anyway.
Right. Right.
So when people talk about wine being chalky or that sort of thing, it's just where I just get off the bus.
Yeah, I have to agree that it's been overdone. The whole soil as part of terroir. I mean, plants are organic; they're not sucking up minerals, but it could be a drainage issue. I don't know. Is chalk limestone? Is that the white? Is the
Yeah, it's a
limestone
very porous
fossilized?
type of
Okay.
limestone. Yeah,
And that's
yeah.
what we have over in England, why some of the Champenois
Right.
are going and planting over there because they've got the white cliffs of Dover and Kent and
Yeah.
wherever they're doing
But
English
again,
sparkling.
right. But again, in England, what you also have is a very cold climate, and we have a warming climate. So what's also going on there is you have the perfect climatic conditions right now for sparkling wine. So it's again, it's not just the soil, it's the
Right.
fact that the climate is perfect for it right now.
Okay. You discussed the complexities of oxidative versus reductive styles of champagne. Can you tell us the difference?
Yeah, so so again, it's something that's best to experience. I do discuss it in the book. If you really want to understand the difference, take a bottle of Bollinger, take a bottle of Laurent Perrier,
Okay.
and drink them both, and you will see the difference. And
Which is
what we're
which?
taught, so Bollinger would be more on the oxidative side, and Laurent
Okay.
Perrier would be more on the non-oxidative or reductive side, you could say.
Okay.
I also suggest, taking an apple and cutting it in half and smelling and tasting what that apple smells like, and then leaving it on the counter for a while, and notice that eventually those fresh fruit notes become more like dried fruit, more like applesauce, more nutty,
Mm-hmm.
versus this fresh, crisp floral type of profile.
That's great.
That's kind of what we're talking about in
Right.
in the difference in styles.
Huh, I love that comparison. That's a great way to explain it. Um, so we've talked about vintage and non-vintage champagnes. You also write about the importance of reserve wines. Why aren't they? What are they? And why don't we talk about those more often?
Well, to answer the second thing, I mean, why we don't talk about reserve wines more often is probably because it's just too geeky of a topic that nobody cares about who drinks
Okay.
drinks wine.
We do.
But yeah, that's right. So we do. But I mean, that might be why they're not talked about. But um, so yeah, reserve wines are really what they say. I mean, reserves wines held back from a vintage year that aren't used, that are stored, and they're historically they're stored really to ensure that you can make wine in bad years, so you have enough wine stored. But what they also do is provide this instant like, complexity and richness to a wine, to a champagne that you can open today, right? And it essentially has some age on that wine. And there are some very good examples of this that I mentioned in the book. Charles Heidsieck Brut Reserve, for example. One of the I've been singing the praise of this champagne for so long, but again, this is another. Used to be a $40 champagne, now it's a $50 champagne, but has a lot of reserve wines and older reserve wines, and you can tell when drinking that the richness, the complexity to it, and you can open it. You don't have to age it; just bring it home and open it. But that's the
Okay.
idea.
All right. Cool. You write about the aging potential of champagne. Um, what's the oldest champagne you've tasted?
The oldest, I'm not exactly sure, and of course, it would. Well, what you're really looking for is the spread between the time and when I drank it. But somewhere around, let's see, somewhere in the 2014, 15, I think I had 1970 Dom Perignon, and
Oh wow.
I've had Salon that was older, which was pretty great. But yeah, so those are some. I mean, I think the thing about champagne is older champagne is great, but you also have to be careful that it's not too old, because unlike, let's say, go to the opposite end of the spectrum, let's say Madeira, which can last forever. Um, Champagne is really delicate and subject to oxidation, and you wait long enough, you're going to get a wine that you don't like.
Right.
So there's some balance there that has to be had.
And so were those mature champagnes that you drank, were they sort of just the nutty kind of darker dried fruit
Yeah,
characteristics in them?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. More nutty, more dried fruit, more savory, even some
Mm.
umami or mushroom characteristics in them,
Mm-hmm.
which I really enjoy. I mean, they're not better objectively, I suppose, but I mean, it's something that I really enjoy. You just get more complexity. Now you do lose some bubbles,
Okay.
and so that's one thing to be aware of. And again, if you were to hold on to a bottle of champagne long enough, you could lose all the bubbles.
Hmm.
And I prefer bubbles in my champagne.
Yeah.
So there's always some danger. But if your champagne is old enough, yeah, it'll have fewer bubbles.
Do the bubbles get smaller as they age?
I don't think the bubbles get smaller; they just simply get fewer.
Fewer.
Because
Yeah.
what you have is a cork that's porous, right? So
Right.
you're getting some oxygen in, and you're getting some carbon dioxide out.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a process. Now it's a very slow process, but and also you have inconsistencies in cork too. That's the other thing. That is, if you open enough bottles of champagne, you will see that some corks hold up better than others for whatever reason. I mean, it's a natural product, and so it's variable. Um, and so that's another that's another issue. It's very disappointing to open a bottle of champagne you've held for a long time, and you open the cork and it just kind of slides out very easily, and it's very thin at this point, and you realize there's no bubbles, and the wine is very oxidized. That's
Mm.
not fun.
That's not fun at all.
No.
I've heard it's a myth, though, that the size of the bubbles determines the quality of the champagne. I mean, to a certain extent, if you've got the big, whatever they call them, frog's eyes bubbles from
Yeah.
injected carbonation, which is a totally
Right.
different way of making bubbly. But I've
Yeah.
heard it's really a myth that, when it's traditional method champagne, if your bubbles are smaller, the champagne is better. Is that true or not?
Yeah, I don't think it's true. I don't think there's any evidence for that.
No, I don't think
Um,
so.
there is something to the traditional method of making sparkling wine, which does seem to make a very softer mousse,
Hmm.
um, as opposed to what you're talking about with like bigger, like a more rough feeling
Yeah.
texture. So there's that, but the bubbles themselves, I don't think. Um, I just don't think there's enough that we know about little small differences in the size of bubbles that would make a difference.
Right. Yeah. There is a researcher who studies bubbles at the University of Champaign. That is his life's work, is the bubbles. But I think it is a myth about the size. But yeah, it can't have that much impact on the quality. What's your opinion on how bottle size affects aging of champagne? Because we know the names are different. I always get confused. You start off with a regular size 750 ml. You go to the Magnum, which is two of the regular bottles, and then it goes
Yeah,
up from there with all sorts of religious names like
yeah,
Nebuchadnezzar and
yeah.
whatever that are different from still. But do you think for those very large format bottles that they age more slowly?
So for all wine, including champagne, they should. I mean, you have a greater you have a see how to put this correctly. There's a greater ratio of wine to headspace in a larger bottle, so it should age more slowly.
So the
And
amount of
so,
oxygen at the top, yeah, is less
yeah,
compared to the volume of liquid, yeah.
and so so they should, and I think, and I've never tested this extensively in champagne, but I've read accounts of people who've opened, a 750 and a Magnum that are of a certain age and noticed, a certain freshness in the Magnum that they didn't see in the 750. So that makes sense. Although again, I can't say that I've tested that myself. Um, so yes, but again, but going back to the cork is still going to be the cork, and so you still have to be somewhat careful there in terms of how old the cork is.
Hmm.
But after that, I just think magnums are just so awesome. I just think when you have a magnum and open up a magnum at a party, it, who doesn't get excited about that?
No, the party
So
begins when you open that Magnum.
exactly. So I love magnums, and really, I when I buy magnums, it's not so much because I'm thinking, oh, I'm gonna hold on to this bottle of champagne for a longer period of time because it's a Magnum and then it's a 750. I buy them because I think, one day I'm just gonna have this super cool party at my house and I'm going to open this and it's going to be really cool. So I think that's the main thing about Magnums.
Absolutely. Um, and you write about dosage. We were talking about that, like the and its role in champagne. Can you explain what dosage is, and then compare it to zero dosage champagnes?
Sure. So dosage is an amount of sugar that is added to a bottle of champagne as part of the topping up of the wine at the very end of the process, right before the bottle gets its cork.
And is it
Uh,
sugar, or is it brandy or grape spirit,
it
or
can
is
be
it any
all.
of that? Okay.
It could be all. It could be a number of things, but what matters. I mean, ultimately, what whatever you're putting, what matters is the sugar. In other words, sugar is simply right a component of a lot of different substances, but what matters is the sugar itself because sugar um, makes things sweeter, right? And
Right.
it also creates this Maillard effect, and
Maillard
um,
effect?
it, so yeah, it's so if you so it's like this browning effect where like if you see it when you cook sometimes, or you'll see this is why sugar is in some things, some items that you wouldn't think are sweet, like ketchup, for example, will often contain sugar. It's to create this balance and also to create this like toasty aspect, toasty profile.
Okay.
But the main thing about dosage that's really important is that this is a very small amount of sugar. Okay, except for champagne. When a champagne is intentionally made sweet, that's one thing. We don't get a lot of sweet champagnes anymore, and I don't really drink them. But if they want to make, somebody wants to make a champagne sweet, then yes, you add a lot of sugar. But we're talking about dry champagnes, where a very small is added amount of sugar is added simply to provide balance, because
Mm-hmm.
champagne is a very high acid wine, and also to add a little bit of richness to balance out that acidity. And if the winemaker did a good job, you should notice the sugar, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Now, zero dosage or brut nature champagnes, they have no added sugar. So at that final step, no sugar is put in. And I talk about some of these in the book some that are very good. Um, but this is where you run into issues because some zero dosage champagnes are not very good, and the reason is they're too dry. Like they lack sugar. There's something missing in that
Hmm.
balance.
Right.
And so I am not against zero dosage champagnes by any means. There are some outstanding ones, but in those cases, it's because the fruit is so ripe, and the flavors are so bright that you don't need any sugar at all. And the right number isn't 2 grams per liter or 3 grams or one. The right number happens to be zero in that case. Um,
Wow. Okay. And so the second fermentation happens inside the bottle for champagne. So when they put the dosage in, it's not going to restart the whole fermentation again. I mean, yeast is in there and it gobbles up. Sugar is yeast food, and then you get more bubbles. But with the dosage, do they risk at all restarting the fermentation inside the bottle again?
no, because so it's two separate steps. So in the second fermentation, you're adding sugar, yeast, and yeast nutrients and a riddling agent. I mean, you're intentionally trying to create a second fermentation. And then what you're going to do is you're going to disgorge. We talked about that a little bit, I
The
think.
spent yeast,
You're
yeah.
going to get rid of that the dead yeast cells. Um, and no, at this stage, you're not putting any yeast in the bottle. This is all about topping up the wine, because in the disgorgement process, you're going to lose a little wine. So you're topping up the wine. In the wine, you're including a little sugar, and really, honestly, you've got a mixture that is your what's called the liqueur d'expedition. And but no, you're not putting yeast, so you're not creating a second fermentation. If you did, you would then get dead yeast cells at the bottom. You get cloudy champagne,
Okay.
which would not be palatable to most consumers, I
Not
don't
good.
think, at this
Yeah.
point.
So we're assuming all the yeast died. Um, Okay, let me, wow, time is flying. All right. Um, Rosé, Billy Cart, Salmon. I never say it. Say it again. I've always said it
I think
wrong, incorrectly.
I have neighbors who call it Billy Cart.
Billy
Uh,
Cart,
but I,
Salmon.
but I think it's Bill Carl. I think would be my very best French pronunciation, but
Okay.
I'm sure somebody can correct me on that.
Have you discovered anything new that you'd add to an updated edition of the book?
Um, no, I don't think so,
Okay, well,
because
that's good.
there isn't going to be a second edition of this book.
Okay, all right.
I think the book stands on its own. I think the book is, it was never intended again to be a catalog
Sure.
of champagne. It's really, again, intended to be a guide for the reader to explore champagne on their own terms
Yeah,
and to be a better champagne drinker by the time they get to the end of the book. And I think it still serves that purpose. So if I ever
absolutely.
do another book, it won't be this one.
And if someone's planning a trip to Champagne, do you have a couple tips on getting the most out of your visit to the region?
Sure, yeah. So I think it would say a couple things. First of all, if you're going to go to Champagne, try to schedule visits at different types of producers, right?
Hmm.
So it's very easy to get into Moet and Veuve Clicquot and take these grand tours that are really interesting and fun, and that's great. But you're going to see this very corporate side of Champagne. Then try to get some visits at smaller producers too, and see how they produce champagne. And you'll just get different experiences, and I think that's something that everybody should do. I would say the second thing is, you know, when you go out to eat, try to drink champagne at the restaurants and drink it through the
Yes.
meal. I mean, do try to experience what it's like in this very safe environment to have champagne with, again, beef, or if you don't like beef, well, something else, whatever. It's fun to just try different types of champagne. There's just so much variety there. I mean, in here in the where I am in the U.S., we have whatever is imported here, which is a
Hmm.
small fraction of what you can buy in Champagne. So I just think it's fun to try different things while you're there.
Absolutely. Um, wow. I don't know if you had a couple wines there that you wanted to mention. If not, that's
Ah,
okay. Because I can't
well,
believe how
you
the
asked
time
me.
is flying.
I mean, do you want me to do that? I can if you want. I did bring two. I don't have to, but if you'd like me to
No, that's
pour a
fine. If you
couple and
haven't opened them, that's fine. We can put links in the show notes so that
yeah.
people
No,
can
I opened
find
them.
them.
I
You
opened
did?
them already.
Oh,
I just
okay.
haven't poured them.
Oh, okay. What two bottles are you? Maybe you just hold up the bottles and then you
So I
can.
can just show you. Sure, yeah. And no champagne's going to go to waste in this house anyway. I'm going to
Okay,
save
great.
these. Um, so one is, let's see here. This is
Let's see.
Lanson Black
Lanson.
Label.
Okay,
Yeah,
Black Label Lanson.
this is one of my top recommendations
Huh. Okay.
for. It's one of my two top recommendations for if you want to spend $45, let's say, and get an outstanding value for your money,
Hmm.
Lanson Black Label. I mean,
Okay.
I just think that and Charles Hyde Seek Brut Reserve, which I think I mentioned earlier,
Right.
because it is the richness, the depth, the complexity that you'll get in this $45 bottle of champagne. You would else otherwise have to spend twice that much. So I love this wine. Um, Another one that is widely available, but that's more expensive. This is now we're talking more like $80, unfortunately. And this is Veuve Clicquot
Oh, Veuve Clicquot Rosé.
Rosé.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yep. Hmm.
And I'm not saying that this is like the very best rosé or that, but it, it is what rosé champagne is supposed to be.
Hmm.
Super floral and fruity and soft, silky, but also just understated and
Sure.
not over the top. It's pretty. um, and long. So this is again 80, $85. I hate that it costs that much now, but I think this is a also a great wine to start with.
Lovely. Wow. Okay. Well, I'm glad we gave you an excuse to open them. Not that you
Yeah,
needed that.
yeah, I don't.
But
I
yeah.
really don't.
So the book is wonderful, Press for Champagne. Is there anything that we haven't mentioned, Chris, that you'd like to mention before we get to where we can find your book and you online?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would say is that I just fundamentally believe that um, wine only matters in its ability for a wine drinker to have this subjective experience, right?
Mm,
So I just, we can read about champagne, we can talk about champagne, but I think so much of wine culture today treats wine like it's an object, like it's a piece of art. And when you read about it, all we hear about are the properties of the wine and who made it and where it was grown, etc. But I think the best thing about wine is just exploring it on your own terms and figuring out what you can learn and taking that journey for yourself.
mm.
I don't see what else matters, honestly, in wine. And so whether you read my book or don't read my book, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference at this point. But I just think I would just encourage everybody to just go and buy champagne, see what you think, have it with someone, and then try something else and see how it's different, and then go from there.
That's great advice. Really great advice. And where can we find you and the book online?
So the book, it's easiest to find it is on Amazon. If you type Press for Champagne book, you will find it on Amazon. And then I have a website. I'm at CS Ruhland, so
Okay,
CSRUHLAND.com.
great. Excellent. We'll put both
Yeah.
in the show notes so that people can find those links easily. Um, don't log off yet, Chris, but I want to say thank you so much. This has been wonderful. It's just flown, and I've learned a number of things about champagne today that I didn't know, and I know our listeners will have
Oh, thank you.
enjoyed the chat as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Thanks, Natalie.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.